The reality is that we talk about it all the time, but how do we know? D.L. Moody used to say that I know I was saved because I was there when it happened. But the reality is that the most radical change that ever come into anyone's life is created by the new birth, by the salvation of Jesus Christ. I mean, let's face it. It is the most radical thing that can happen to anyone ever. I mean, it is more radical than anything you could possibly imagine. I remember when I was 10, we had a guy come to our house. He was a member of our church, and he brought his kids with him. And all the other kids got to go out in the front yard and play, but he drugged me in the living room, and me and my mom and dad and this guy, and he shared the gospel with me. And the thing is, I was 10. I didn't really understand. I knew, number one, his kids were out there playing, and I wanted to be out there playing with them. And number two, and this is a really strange thing to think when you're 10, that I would get to take the Lord's Supper. I would get the little cracker and juice on Sundays, and okay, it wasn't that special, but I didn't know any better. And that I would get baptized, and so that sounded really cool, and so that sounded like a good idea to me. I was 10, and I didn't understand. I didn't have any concept about what sin was and the transition that would happen. But I still remember being in sixth grade, seventh grade, and meeting somebody who was a church member. There were kids in our neighborhood, and they cursed and swore and all that. And I remember thinking, they used to tell us, well, I'm a Christian too. I got baptized. And I remember thinking at the time, that's not what being a Christian is. It means you change. I knew that instinctively somehow. When I was 14, after my father's death, I became a believer. I came to understand that Jesus died for my sin, that he rose again, and that I was saved because of what he did. But it was a radical impact on my life. The reality is that when you are saved, you pass from death unto life. You're no longer dead, you're alive. You go from darkness to light, from hell to heaven. The experience we call salvation and the gospel, it happens to different people in different ways, but all the reality is the end result is the same. You get to spend eternity with Jesus Christ. The Apostle Paul was struck on the ground by a blinding light. Lydia was converted in a quiet riverside prayer meeting, and it can happen in 1,000 different ways. The important thing is that you know that it has happened. If you know that you have a one-on-one intimate relationship with the Lord God himself based on what Jesus did, then Corinthians says that all things become new. When we're crucified with Christ, but nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ lives in me. I'm a new creature in Christ. And so we're going to look at John 9 today. Now, I know that we're kind of rushing our way through John, and I'm not trying to. There you go, Morgan. Thank you. Excuse me a second. Bad time to sneeze. In the book of John, we're going to be looking at 9, and on that morning there was a blind man who rose that morning. I guarantee you he didn't know that his life was about to be radically changed. He was about to meet one-on-one with Jesus. In John chapter 8, Jesus said that he was the light of the world, and in John chapter 9, Jesus proves it. As Jesus and his disciples leave the city of Jerusalem for the Feast of the Tabernacles, they come across a man born blind from birth. The disciples turn to Jesus and verse 2 ask the why question that we're all tempted to ask from time to time. Why has this happened? In this case, what is the reason for this man's blindness? Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parent, that he was born blind? The disciples displayed the beliefs of that day and were sure that one of the two reasons accounted for this. Either the man had sinned or his parents had. And it would seem to us the fact that the man's blindness began at birth would have excluded him from consideration. That it was the man's sin. It was his parents' sin that caused the blindness. But see, the reality is that we don't think the same way they do. And the philosophy was then that some Jews believed in the pre-existence of the soul, which is the belief that all souls have already existed in the Garden of Eden before the creation of the world. This implied that somehow this man must have sinned in a former state before he came into this world, and thus his punishment came into this world blind. Now, we don't believe that, and the Bible doesn't teach that, but that's kind of what was being taught at that point. The question of whether the sin or this man's parents had caused his blindness reflected a misunderstanding of Exodus 34:7. which says the sins of the father will be extended to the third and fourth generation. That is that sin so deeply corrupts our relationships that several generations of a family can be affected by serious sin. Jesus finishes answering their questions in verse 3 and 4 by stating the better question. It's not why has this happened, but what does God want to accomplish through it? He further states that neither this man nor his parents' sin had caused the blindness, but rather that the glory of God could be revealed to him. This does not imply that neither this man nor his parents were sinless, but rather that their sin is not the cause of the blindness. Look, guys, you need to be real clear on something. Not all illness, not all pain, not all tragedy is a result of you sinning. It is not God standing up heaven with a silver hammer waiting to bop you in the head every time you make a mistake. Jesus did not say that sickness and disease were never the consequence of sin, but it is a great mistake to think of all of man's sickness and illness are due to sin. Well, in a sense they are. Because remember, we're in a fallen world. We're in a world that's been cursed because of our sin. So in a sense, yeah, all the evil that happens in this world is a result of our sin. But not your specific sin. We're talking about sin of man as, in terms of the fall. Okay, God cursed this world because of our sin. Adam and Eve disobeyed, and we're thrown out of the garden, and we're suffering the consequences. We live in a cursed world. And Jesus is not saying this man was made to go through this entire life at this point blind in order that God could heal him so the works of God could be made manifest. We don't have a cruel and capricious God. We have a kind and gracious God. And whether he's saying this man's blindness was something that God was going to use, through which his works are manifest. Tragedies such as illness and accidents give God the opportunity to reveal himself in unique ways. It was a tragedy that robbed Joni Eareckson Tada of her ability to move. But through Joni, the Lord has encouraged thousands, and he continues to display his glory. Think about Corrie ten Boom. Corrie ten Boom was rounded up and thrown into prison because she was helping Jews in occupied Nazi Germany. Her whole family died. She's the only member of her family that survived it. Her daughter died in her sister died in the prison camp. Her mom died in the prison camp. Her dad died in the prison camp. Her grandfather died in the prison camp. She is the only family member that survived the prison camps. And the thing is, she learned to let God be in control of this. She could have gotten bitter and angry and hateful and all that stuff, but she decided that she was going to turn it over to God and let him use it to bring glory out of it. See, that's a hard concept for us because we think, well, we're waiting for God to get revenge. Well, God, this person cut me off in traffic. Knock him down. Hit him with a lightning bolt. Bop him with a hammer. That's kind of the way we think. We cannot, the reality is that tragedies happen, and we live in a real world where tragedies occur. But God uses those tragedies sometimes to display his glory. We cannot choose how God will glorify himself in us, but we seek to glorify him through whatever our situation. So in verse 6, Jesus now turns his attention to the blind man. When he had said these things, he spat on the ground and made clay with the saliva and anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay. And he said to him, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam," which is translated sent. And so he went and washed and came back seeing. Now, we look at this kind of funny and we think, okay, this is weird. Okay. In modern world action of covering someone's eyes with spittle and mud would have been more likely to make a seeing man blind than to make a blind man see. But that's not the purpose of it. The mud is not doing the healing. This is not about the healing process, but the primary purpose of the placement on the man's eyes was to evoke hope and expectation in him. Another reason for the application of the moist clay had been to convince those that saw the miracle the source of the healing was not so much the use of means of clay, but in God and Jesus, who was the healer. Okay, verse 7, Jesus commands the man to go and wash. Yet we should note that in spite of the fact that this man had never requested a cure, he did as Jesus told him to. He was obedient. So he went and he washed and he came back seeing. Okay, so in verse 8, the blind man's neighbors are amazed at the healing. Therefore, the neighbors and those who previously had seen it, that he was blind, said, his neighbors and those who formerly had seen him as a beggar said, "Isn't this the man who sat begging?" And some said, "He's the one." No, others were saying, "But he looks like him." He kept saying, "I'm the one." And therefore they asked him, "Then how were your eyes open?" And he answered, "The man called Jesus made mud, spread it on my eyes, and told me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' So I went and I washed and I received my sight." "Where is he?" they asked. "I don't know," he said. The healed man obviously knew that he could now see, and they asked him how this had happened. He told them about the man called Jesus and how he had been cured. So according to Jewish law, when someone was cured of a disease, they were to have the cure certified by the local religious authorities. The neighbors now take the man to the Pharisees that they might examine him. They immediately pose the Pharisees with a problem. How could they certify this man as being cured and continue to reject the one who cured him? Okay. Unfortunately, the blind man is brought to the religious leaders in verse 13. They ultimately, and they brought him who formerly was blind to the Pharisees. Now it was a Sabbath when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. And the Pharisees who also asked him again how he'd received his sight. And he said, he put clay on my eyes and washed, and I see. Therefore some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God because he does not keep the Sabbath. They said, how can a man who is a sinner do such signs? And there was a division among them. And they said to the blind man again, what do you say about him because he opened your eyes? And the man said, he's a prophet. The miracle caused a debate among the religious leadership. Some argued that a person could work on the Sabbath could not possibly be from God. To the Pharisees, the legalistic keeping of the Sabbath was more important to them than the stunning miracle that just happened. Look, guys, here's what they're saying. Here's what's going on here. He comes to him, he's been healed on the Sabbath. You're not allowed to work on the Sabbath. Shabbat in the Hebrew basically means it's a day of rest. You're not allowed, and it's a lot more than what's in Scripture. I mean, what we see in the Bible is very, very short compared to all the laws they build up around it. Pharisees had over 3,000 laws surrounding the keeping of the Ten Commandments. And you weren't, they were very specific. This was keeping the Ten Commandment, this wasn't. If you had to walk 50 feet, you had to take a chair, you had to put a chair out halfway and take a seat and rest for a little bit. That kind of stuff. You were allowed to go do work if it meant rescuing a life, but you couldn't do anything else. You couldn't heal it, you couldn't make it better, you could just keep it from dying. I mean, it was just convoluted. Now, and so they're saying that because Jesus healed him on the Sabbath, that he can't be the Messiah. He can't be the healer because God doesn't use people who violate his law. So others object and say how come one is able to do these things not from God, and they refuse to believe this man was really blind until they questioned his parents. So we read in verse 18, but the Jews did not believe concerning him that he'd been blind and received his sight until they called the parents of him who had received his sight. And they asked them, saying, is this your son who you say was born blind? How does he now see? His parents answered them and said, we know this is our son, and he was born blind. But by what means he now sees, we do not know, or who opened his eyes, we do not know. He is of age, ask him. He will speak for himself. Parents said these things because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had agreed already that if anyone confessed that he was Christ, he would be put out of the synagogue. And therefore his parents said, he is of age, ask him. Although the parents confirmed that this man was their son and that he had been born blind, they denied knowing how this had come about. They sought to remove themselves from the spotlight and thus the wrath of the Pharisees by telling them that their son was old enough to answer for himself. Okay, so now the Pharisees cross-examined the blind man, beginning in verse 24. So they again called the man who was blind and said to him, give God the glory. We know that this man is a sinner. He answered and said, whether he is a sinner or not, I do not know. One thing I know, that though I was blind, now I see. Then they said to him, what did he do to you? And how did he open your eyes? And he answered again, I told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples? Then they reviled him and said, you are his disciple, but we are Moses' disciples. We know that God spoke to Moses. As for this fellow, we do not know where he is from. The real meat of what I want to share with you today is found in the striking contrast between the we know of the Pharisees and the I know of the former blind man. The we is emphatic, emphasizing that whatever the case may be with ignorant people, it's like blind beggars. These religious experts have knowledge and have begun to lay it out in a concise manner. The first thing they say is, well, we know this man is a sinner. Why is he a sinner? Because he healed somebody on the Sabbath. He had compassion on somebody who was hurting and in need. Isn't that kind of what we do? Oh, no, you can't do this. And we get all worked up. I've got friends of mine, and I won't give you names because you wouldn't know them anyway, but who get very upset if members of their congregation don't make it on Sunday because they're out doing ministry. I'm like, excuse me? What planet are you from? So a second time, they summoned the man who had been born blind and told him, give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner. Okay? He's a sinner. We know he's a sinner. He's a sinner because we say he's a sinner. And what I find funny, excuse me, as he looks at him and says, well, are you wanting to be his disciples too? Now, what does that say about the blind man? He's starting to realize that this was a miraculous thing. It had changed him. Now, they look at him and say, well, we know that God spoke through Moses. But we don't know where he came from. We know that God spoke to Moses, but this man, we don't even know where he's from. We don't know where he's from. We know that we spoke through Moses. We're Moses' disciples. Now, the problem, of course, is that if they're Moses' disciples, they got a problem, because the word disciple means a one-on-one personal relationship. That's what the word disciple means. It's how it's part of the language. So what they're basically saying is they're having a one-on-one personal relationship with a dead guy who's been dead for 1,000 years. That's a pretty good trick. But that's neither here nor there. The whole point here is that they're saying that Moses is better than the one who healed. And they angrily replied that they will follow the law of Moses. That's what they're saying. We're not under the glare of the hostile probing. The man asked them, perhaps with a little bit more of irony, do you want to be his disciples too? And the man continues his response to the Pharisees in verses 30 through 34. And so the reality is that we don't know where the Pharisees are saying we don't know where he came from. We believe that God spoke through Moses. We don't believe that God spoke to this man. We know that this man is a sinner. He's a sinner for one and one reason only. We've never seen him sin. We know it's a sinner because he healed you on the Sabbath. That's it. That's the whole basis of their philosophy. If you violated the Sabbath, I don't care what the purpose was, even if you were saving a life, you were a sinner because you had violated the Sabbath. Now, the problem, of course, then is that Jesus is the Sabbath. I mean, the reality is that they missed all this. They were so busy focusing on trying to knock Jesus down and keep the healing quiet that they didn't want anybody to realize this. He had healed a blind man. A blind man a man who had born blind. So they're denying where he came from. They're denying who he is. They're denying, that God spoke to him. Basically, he's saying that he's nothing but a pagan and he's a false prophet. And what I find funny about this, and not funny, haha, but funny, weird, then we've got the Pharisees on one side, all these religious leaders. They're so convinced that Jesus can't be the Messiah. And then the blind man on the other side. And the man continues to respond to the Pharisees in verses 30 through 34. And he answered and said to them, why is this marvelous thing that you do not know where he is from? Yet he has opened my eyes. Now we know that God does not hear sinners, for if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, he hears him. Since the world began, it has been unheard of that anyone opened the eyes of one who was born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. They answered and said, you are completely born in sins, and you are teaching us. And they cast him out. He was amazed at these powerful religious leaders did not know where Jesus was from then he was by fear of what they could do to him. He marveled at the way the Pharisees seemed to ignore the evidence. In the case, the Pharisees, their devout devotion to God, displaced it as it was, became their greatest obstacle to seeing who God really was. You see, they had their blinders on. This is what we've always believed. This is always what we thought, and I don't want to be bothered with the truth. But see, the blind man knows who the Messiah is because, as he says, I know I used to be blind and now I see. How can you argue with that? I'm blind. I was blind. Now I'm seeing. I once was blind, but now I see. And I know that God doesn't hear sinners. Okay, I know that God does not hear those who. I know that God hears those who worship Him and do His will. If God doesn't listen to sinners, but if anyone is God-fearing and does His will, He listens to him. We know that God does hear those who worship Him and do His will. Throughout history, no one has ever heard of anyone opening the eyes of a blind person. He also says, I know, and this know is implied. If the man were not from God, he could do nothing. The blind man did not even know who Jesus was but he stood up for the truth. He may have been blind, but even he could see what was going on here. His strategy was great for denial. It was Jesus who gave him his sight. No one is going to make him take sides against him. If this man were not from God, he wouldn't be able to do anything. See, that's where our world comes in. We don't want to hear about Jesus because we don't want to know the truth. We've got our own truth and we've made it up and we've decided this is what I believe. And unfortunately, it's not just the world, it's the church. We've got folks in the church who decided this is what we believe about Jesus, and I don't want to be bothered with Scripture. I'm going to ignore this part, and I'm going to take this part, and I'm going to keep this part, and I'm going to mow that part down, and I'm going to re-edit or alter this stuff because it doesn't fit my worldview. And when it says they cast him out, and they mean they executed him from worshiping in the temple. Basically, he could no longer come back to the temple because of this. But nothing I could take away from him began to compare with what he'd been given by Christ. Now, here's the other side to that, and you need to understand something. As a blind man, he could not go in to the court of the men. Okay, he had to worship out in the court of the Gentiles. You know why? Because he was handicapped. And the Jewish law said that if you had a disability, if you were blind, lame, leper, you weren't allowed to enter in because it was supposed to mean that you were cursed by God. And until you confessed your sin and God healed you, then you couldn't come in. You had unrepentant sin. That was their theology. So as a blind man, he wouldn't have been able to go into the temple in the first place. He could have gone but now he's being told you're not even allowed to come to the temple of the Gentiles. You're not allowed to come to the Gentile court, the outer court. But nothing they could do could make him begin to compare with what he had given by Christ. He had been radically, unalterably changed. Verse 35 tells us that Jesus heard that they cast him out, and when he found him, he said to him, "Do you believe in the Son of God?" And he answered and said, "Who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him?" And Jesus said to him, "You have seen him, and it is he who is talking to you." And he said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshipped him. When Jesus heard the blind man had been thrown out to the Pharisees, he found him and revealed to him who he was. And it radically changed him. I know if this man were not from God, he could do nothing. I know that I was blind and now I say, I know that God does not hear sinners. I know that God does hear those who worship him and do his will. Look, guys, here's reality. When you come face to face and encounter with God, you will be changed. You don't hear anything else I say tonight, go back and take your nap now. Your encounter with Jesus Christ will change you. When Jesus heard the blind man, he gave him an opportunity to believe. The blind man had progressively grown and realizing that Jesus was, in verse 11, all he knew that he was. He was a man called Jesus, but by verse 17, he called him a prophet. And in verse 38, he's calling him Lord and worshiping him. There's a transition here, and it's just like us. Those words are haunting to me. I think of how many people I've seen walk the aisles of a church through the years and join the church but never give evidence of worshiping the Lord or belonging to him. Some of those who join the church never darken the door of the church again. They never give $1. They never show any interest. Have they been saved, or did they just join the church? You know, you're fond of hearing, I'm sure you've heard me say this enough times, coming to church does not make you a believer any more than going to McDonald's makes you a Big Mac. The blind man was cast out, and the reality is that we can know the same things about Jesus. We can know that I was blind, but now I see. Lord, I believe that you are the Son of God. I believe that I can believe in him, Lord. But you have seen him, and he was walking with you, and he says, Lord, I believe, and I can worship him. When that blind man got up this morning, he had no clue the radical change he was going to take. He got up, had no idea that this day would be any different from the rest. I am sure that he planned to live out that day pretty much the way he did every other day. In the blackness of darkness, he would realize that day there was a man named Jesus who was going to shatter his darkness forever. Maybe the question for you today, do you prefer the darkness, or will you come to the light? If you're already his, won't you live so this world will know that you have been with Jesus? You could say, I was blind, but now I see. I was lost, but now I'm found. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. Was blind, but now I see. You have both seen him, and it is he who is talking to you. And he says, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped. Because the ultimate expression of your belief is worship. It always has been. It always will be. So how does that affect us? What does that mean to us as believers? I mean, most of us have been in church almost all our lives. We've done ministry. We've talked about ministry. We've talked about our radical impact. But here, I want you to know something. If you believe that He is the Son of God, then it must radically affect the way you live your life. Lord, I believe is not just a statement. It's not just a phrase. It is a way of life, and it means that you are going to be transformed. When you got up that morning before you got saved, you didn't know that your life was about to change completely and radically, and it will change again, and it will keep changing, and God will transform you. And then you can say with the blind man, Lord, I believe, and worship Him. Lord, I believe, and I worship you. It's the only way you will ever truly worship is because you believe that He is Lord. He is King of kings and Lord of lords. And at His name every knee shall bow and every tongue confess that He is Lord. He was nailed to a cross for you and rose again. For that blind man, He died on a cross. And that blind man knew that Jesus was the Messiah. Because he was once blind, but now I'm see. That's just us. I was a beggar, and now I'm fed. I was sick, and now I'm well. I was lost, but now I'm found. I was blind, now I see. John Wesley, not John Wesley, but the author of the hymn Amazing Grace was a slave captain. He grew up at sea. He went off to sea when he was very young. His father died, and although his mother had tried to raise him, when he got to be old enough, and you got to remember, at 8 or 9, you could go off to sea and be a cabin boy, and so that's what he did. And his whole adult life, until he was about 25 or 30, he worked on a slave ship. He was a mate, and he was a crewman, and eventually he became captain of his own ship. And he would go to Africa and capture slaves and carry them back to the slave market and sell them in Europe. Anyway, something happened on the trip, and they had an empty cargo. They hadn't picked up the cargo yet, but they were on their way, and they ran into a huge storm, and it destroyed the ship, demasted it, left them sailing in the middle of the ocean. No food, no water, most of the crew gone. After several days, all those verses that he used to, because when he was growing up, he knew enough scripture to make fun of it, and so he would radically pick it and attack it and belittle it and haggle it. And every verse he ever misquoted, every verse he ever read and made fun of, God began to quote back to his mind. Eventually, he fell on his face, begged God to forgive him, and vowed that he would get out of the slave trade, that he would follow God, and that he would be God's servant for as long as God would have him. What's amazing is that he wrote that hymn on his anniversary as a pastor. As a pastor, he wrote that. Written by a guy named John Newton. He wrote it as a sermon illustration in 1773, nearly 25 years after his salvation. And he wrote those words, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. What saved us, folks, is God's amazing grace. God's amazing grace. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. I mean, think about those words. He radically changed us. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear, the hour I first believed. The Lord has promised good to me, his word my hope endures. How will my shield and portion be, he will my shield and portion be, as long as life endures. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. God's grace is a beautiful component of our faith, and a blind man knew that it radically changed him, and it can radically change you. Maybe you don't know him. Maybe you don't have that relationship. That can be you. God will change you. He will transform you. But more importantly, it is his amazing grace that transforms all of us. Jesus died for you on a